This panel will discuss some of the polarized views sparked by Milton Friedman's ideas on the social responsibility of businesses. As I'm sure most of you know, Milton Friedman argued that a company has no social responsibility to the public or society, and its only responsibility is to its shareholders. And of course, not everyone agrees. So to whom are businesses responsible? Please join me in welcoming on stage Professor Arnoud Meyer, Mr. Patrick Daniel, Professor Narayan Pant, and of course, Mr. Richard Quest. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Vinika Raoul. Yes, please also note that anytime during the discussion, you may submit your questions to Pigeonhole Live by scanning this QR code. Selected questions will be answered during the Q&A session. Over to you, Dr. Raoul.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And to the 300 people who've joined us online, a very warm good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Isn't this a pleasure to be able to do a properly hybrid event after all the challenges of the last 2 years? So after that, a very inspiring set of opening addresses in terms of responsible leadership, steward leadership towards building a better collective future, we're tasked now with reconciling the tension between higher purpose and profit, on the other hand. Now, we want to do this, as our anchor was just telling us, by comparing and contrasting the views expressed by Milton Friedman in 1970 with those expressed about half a century later by a group of American CEOs who signed off the Statement of Corporate Purpose. To set the stage, let me just perhaps do a short quote from each of these, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Milton Friedman, in his famous article, The Social Responsibility of Business in 1970, which I can see from the nods earlier, most of you are familiar with, he said, and I quote, "There is one and only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud." So quite clear there, perhaps because of his rationale of managers being agents of the owners, a clear focus and emphasis on maximizing shareholder profits. Now, half a century later, in 2019, a group of American CEOs, as I said, signed off the Statement on Purpose of a Corporation. They said something a little different. Their stated view was, and I quote again, "While each of our individual companies serves its own corporate purpose, we share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders," end quote. They go on then to talk about the responsibilities that they perceive to customers, to employees, to suppliers, and to the wider community. So, which view do we agree with here? And perhaps more importantly, are we brave enough to say what we truly believe? That's what we're going to be talking about. We have 40 minutes in this wonderfully illustrious panel, so I think we should get right into it. A very warm welcome to Patrick, Arnoud, and Narayan, and of course Richard, not forgetting, very much also with us online. So I think to start us off, Arnoud, I'll come to you first and request that you perhaps speak to the general theme of this discussion. Do you think we're finally at the point where higher purpose is what we can emphasize because that's the business case? As opposed to profit, or is it still, where Friedman was coming from half a century ago, still more in terms of apparently maximizing profit?
Being the chairman of the Stewardship Asia Center, you know what my position is going to be, right? Obviously, I'm more in favor of the view that stakeholders are as important, if not more important than shareholders, and that I'm more with the business roundtable. But actually, in preparation of this discussion, and give me 2 minutes, in preparation of discussion, I actually went back to the original writings of Milton Friedman. And of course, what he was proposing was a very stylized economic model on the basis of very simple assumptions, which in practice are not true and not existent. Simple assumptions where we have a perfect market, where everybody has transparency. Secondly, there are no externalities or the government can completely take care of it. And thirdly, we can write perfect contracts. Now, everybody knows that those three conditions do not exist in practice. So in fact, what was a stylized model has become a mantra. And that's often happening when economists or academics write something that is quite nice on paper in an article and good for the debate of an academic conference, and then suddenly journalists run away with it and make this the mantra that we have to work with. The same is true for shareholder value. It was originally a model that was developed to manage the relationship between the CEO, an agency model between the CEO and the shareholders. And it's so attractive, a shareholder value model, because you can measure it. And everything that we can measure becomes extremely attractive. So I think that we have been seduced in the 70s, 80s, and 90s by models which were nice, stylized academic models, but which somehow became very popular. The good news is that we are actually coming back from that, and that we do understand that, as Dylan already pointed out, but also Rajiv pointed out, that a company has a very different purpose. It may be a bad purpose, as Rajiv was indicating, but it has a different purpose than only shareholder value or making profits. By definition, it has this different approach. And so that's the point that I try to make as a representative here of Stewardship Asia Center, that is that we really have to think through about what is the purpose of the firm and how can we align it with what the needs of society are all about. So I'm on the side of the business roundtable.
I would be very surprised if you weren't. Okay, well, thank you for that. And before we proceed further, I do want to remind everyone we're taking questions from the audience towards the end, so please do send them in. And to my panelists, do feel free to jump in, to refute, and to comment, please. I tried
to get that QR code, and it went away so fast.
Oh dear.
I think you should reproject it for a few, otherwise people will not be able to answer questions.
Okay, certainly. Can we just please have that pigeonhole code back up again so everyone can access that? Thank you for mentioning that, Arnoud. Okay, so moving now to the other academic on our panel, Narayan. So perhaps what I want to ask you is, of course, we're talking about steward leadership, and as Arnoud mentioned, he's very much on that side. But can I ask you, do you think Arnoud is speaking to the true views of business leaders everywhere? Or is he really stating what business leaders want to be heard to say, but perhaps not necessarily what they feel and what their actions tell us they feel?
Thank you, Vinika. Shall we start by stipulating the goals? Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody in this room, or indeed in any academic environment, will disagree with the goals that Dylan outlined, right? ESG goals, environment, social, governance. We'll stipulate these things. The real discussion is in how do we get to them, right? So when you think about Milton Friedman, he was talking about, he was speaking and writing in a certain context. And the context was that of the imperial CEO, right? CEOs who reported and were accountable to nobody. And Milton Friedman had to make a point. They said, wait a minute, you're an agent. You're an agent of a principal who actually owns the firm. And you're responsible to that person, right? So everything that you do in concert. Now, what Dylan said is he outlined the role of the board in this context, which I think is extremely appropriate. Because now, when you ask CEOs, now when you ask executive management teams to follow certain sustainable measures or any other forms or any other components of steward leadership, now you have the CEOs accountable to somebody. My terror, I will tell you, right, as someone who's been working with leaders now for 30 years, right, my terror is saying, you need to do this, but not holding people accountable for doing it. Right? Because then you'll have two bad outcomes. One, it doesn't get done, and instead we work on ticking the box. Two, people do things which have doubtful value, and we ascribe it to this good purpose that we think, allows us to justify whatever it is that we do. So I have no problem, and I think anybody in business school would stipulate to the goals. However, working with leaders as I do, the one thing I do know is we need accountability, and we need some kind of notion that I as the CEO or I as the executive management team need to perform, need to deliver on this, otherwise I'm not doing a good job, right? The reason why Arnoud says, there's been this complete fixation with shareholder value maximization is precisely as you said. It's measurable and it's rewarded, right? So if you measure something else and you reward something else, you will get alternative behavior. You don't do it, and it's going to be very hard.
So CEOs need to be incentivized and held accountable if we expect them to really get down to doing the kind of steward leadership we're speaking about.
I think, see, there's a contradiction in some of the comments that were made here, right, which I want to parse out. We have been arguing that stewardship is actually good business, in which case there's no contradiction, right? Maybe there's a distinction between short-term value maximization versus longer-term value maximization, and that's a matter for evidence, right? We can get there. However, if we're arguing that despite there being a cost to shareholder value maximization, we want you to follow a certain course of action, then it's not a matter of incentives. I need to be accountable, whether with an incentive or not, to somebody. And as long as that accountability doesn't exist, I don't think you're going to get the behavior that you seek. This is just my humble observation based on the behavior of people. This is what you're not going to get. Okay. Right? Again, I'm stipulating to the goals. I'm stipulating to the outcomes that we all want. The question is, what are the best mechanisms by which we get them?
Great. So maybe we'll ask the question now to someone who has worn the CEO hat. And Patrick, coming to you, to Narayan's point about the need for accountability, the need for CEOs to be held to do something. Yeah. Are we really still at a point where it's only shareholders who can hold CEOs accountable? Or what about all of the other stakeholders who are beginning to have a much more active voice? Those of us who work in higher education with younger people, for instance, I'm constantly heartened by the fact that we have students who tell us that they're going to be the kind of customers who will not buy from you, or the kind of employees who will not work with you, or the kind of investors who will just not give you money if you don't prioritize these other societal and environmental obligations.
Can I situate Friedman before I answer that question?
By all means.
Yeah? Actually, this quote that you cited was from a 1970 article. Actually, Milton Friedman in the 1960s and 70s was actually outside the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right.
And he was an ideologue for free markets. And he was actually railing against socialist ideas. I went back and read his article. Let me quote you exactly what he says, what he thinks about the social responsibility. It's actually quite amazing. And he says why he doesn't agree with the doctrine of social responsibility. Because it involves the acceptance of the socialist view that political mechanisms, not market mechanisms, are the appropriate way to determine the allocation of resources. So he was really railing against, a kind of like a tide of socialist ideas. And in the 60s, his free market capitalism was actually losing a bit of its shine. And so he was just being polemical. He was just putting out an alternative view. So that quote, actually, if you ask him today, if he were alive today, he would actually sort of say, maybe I'll soften that a bit, because he did actually.
Yes.
He did actually go and the actual quote that you said actually came from the last paragraph. And the funny thing is, he was quoting himself from his 1962 book, So I read you this. He says, okay, the doctrine of social responsibility, which is the point that we're discussing, taken seriously would extend the scope of the political mechanism to every human activity. So I'm scratching my head and saying, what? I mean, we're just talking about shareholder value and all that. He's making a political, statement here, and he says, I have called it, this social responsibility, a fundamentally subversive doctrine. And then he proceeds to say that you have only one responsibility to shareholder. So, it's 50 years since. This was him when he was outside the mainstream. And then, of course, when Reagan adopted his star shone, Maggie Thatcher believed in him. And then suddenly everybody thought what he said is accurate. And as Arnoud says, finally it has taken us 20 years before it now comes back to the middle. So it's been a kind of a tide of different views about this. But one of the points I find very strange about his article is, do you know, he says all this, but when it comes to a individual businessman who runs his own business, it's okay. You can do whatever you like because it's your money. So I find that a little bit inconsistent. You know, how is it that just because I work for a company with shareholders, I have a different set of values, but if it's my own company, I can do whatever I like. I mean, there's something wrong there. It doesn't quite gel. So I think now the systems that we are talking about, I mean, the values that we're talking about, actually apply across the board. You know, whether you run your own company, whether you have shareholders, whether you're a charity, whether you run a university, you know, there are certain values about steward leadership, about, you know, being long-term, about looking after employees. So I think we're now becoming, you know, a bit more wholesome in our purpose. Whereas Friedman was just going after shareholder capitalism. That was all. You know, if you have shareholders, you do what they say. You make profits for them. So I think we've moved beyond that. And we are all trying to move beyond that. So that's my long answer to your question.
Okay, all right. And Richard, I haven't forgotten you. So you know, just bringing back the debate to stakeholders, broader stakeholders versus shareholders. So you're out there all the time talking to CEOs everywhere and having conversations about how they feel about, you know, about stakeholder capitalism versus focus on shareholders, etc. And of course, the fashionable view is the one that we're hearing a lot of, and it is towards broader stakeholder maximization. So I want to ask you quite simply and directly, because that's your style. Are you fed up of the hypocrisy of some CEOs, where they're telling us this, but they don't always believe or do what they say they're doing?
Well, they'll say they're doing the right thing, and they'll say they're doing it for the right reason, and they may honestly and genuinely believe that they are. Nobody, unless the most evil and malevolent, goes out and says, I'm going to poison some streams and rivers, I'm going to send children up the chimney, age 10, and I'm going to do whatever I can to damage the environment. Nobody knowingly says that. And when you ask these people, these CEOs, they have a raft of good reasons for why they've done what they're doing. But at the end of the day, it comes back to what Rajiv was saying about integrity and leadership and the choice of those leaders by the board. A good example at the moment, because whilst I take great respect to your panel, it's about the real world. And the real world involves trying to make hard decisions in difficult cases. So you take the current Disney chief executive, Bob Chapek, who had to take a decision on the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And initially, he basically said Disney wasn't going to get involved. Well, the other half of Disney, the employees and all the organizations and the LGBT community went up against him. Now he's in the very difficult position. He has pissed off the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who could well be a major presidential contender. His employees are unhappy with him because he moved like the whisk of the wind and didn't stand up for what people believe is right in the first place. And the stakeholders, the shareholders, are angry because he has failed to, he's basically put the company's reputation and the share price under pressure. So Bob Chapek, who didn't do what he should arguably have done, which was stand up in the first place, because arguably frightened of his own shadow on this issue, tried to juggle everything at once, and then spectacularly failed by dropping all the balls. So what could he have done differently? That's a question your panel might want to think about. And then you have the simple, that you have the inexplicable, the Peter Hepplethwaite, the P&O ferries. Now, his shareholder is DP World in the Gulf. They were obviously aware of what he was planning to do. They were obviously aware, maybe not the details about consultation, and they signed on for it as well. But now you have a sovereign wealth fund that owns the company, that therefore empowers the chief executive to make a decision that is absolutely abhorrent by industrial standards. Who do you blame? Where are the consequences? Those are the answers. And unless you have got integrity to start with, if your goal is simply to maximize profit, then you're screwed from the get-go.
Okay. On that note, now coming back to you, Narayan, are we perhaps asking too much of our business leaders? Is trying to maximize shareholder value while also maximizing all the other stakeholders that they have to be concerned about just going to require a Herculean effort and some extraordinary, sort of capabilities that our CEOs unfortunately just don't have today? Just the fact that they're employing so many people, they're generating profits and then paying taxes on them, and if they're abiding by rules and regulations, are they not already doing enough? And shouldn't we then leave the other responsibilities to the government authorities, et cetera, who are trained and equipped to do these?
Look, Vinika, what are we asking people to do? I mean, to come back to Richard's point, we're asking them to change behavior. And anybody who's over 18 years old knows how difficult that is, right? So what it's going to take is several rounds of action-reaction, to Richard's point. Right? The CEO of Disney discovered that by not paying attention to a whole bunch of stakeholders in his organization, it could cost his corporation value and his employees, potentially, right? And this is a learning. Now, people learn as that goes along. It goes along by osmosis. So this whole process of change isn't only one person deciding that, look, I'm going to behave differently. It's an entire ecosystem changing. This is why the term "it takes a village" is so appropriate in this case, because it is going to take a village, right? We're actually talking about changing mindsets that people have grown up in for a significant period of time. He wants to say something. He's putting his finger up. Richard.
Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, forgive me. I just want to jump in and ask you, that's true. It requires change, but then do you feel that there are too many boards and too many CEOs, bluntly, trying to make an omelette without breaking eggs?
So, again, yes, too many people are trying to square the circle, right? Because there are, as you said, hard choices that need to be made. These are allocation decisions. These are choices of taking a hit on this year's profits because we think it's the right thing to do at the moment. But by the same token, there are many people whom you will see who do make those hard decisions. It's just that it hasn't diffused as much into the zeitgeist, into the psyche of everybody who's observing this to feel empowered to make these sorts of choices, right? So I'll put my hand up and say we business schools who've been teaching shareholder profit maximization for the last God knows how many decades, we're as much at fault of perpetuating this idea. And so starting from there to the rest of society, we have to change the way in which we think. We are accountable to people whether they're paying our salaries or not. And if we don't realize that, guess what? To Rajiv's point, it's going to hurt us and it's going to hurt our shareholders.
And I would add to that that change happens in small steps. Yep. Rajiv actually answered to your question that the CEO that suddenly wakes up and she or he says, what should I do? That you take the two first little steps. In my own experience, not as an academic, but more than as a manager and a member of boards, I think going back to what is the purpose and what's in the purpose of the organization. And purpose is about why is my work important to the society. Thinking about what it has to do with the environment is very important. And secondly, I found it very interesting in the boards in which I worked to do a bit of stakeholder mapping. And it's amazing how difficult that exercise actually is in practice, to say who are my stakeholders, what's their influence, what's their stake they have, what do they want me to do, and how do I build their thinking into my decision making. Just taking those two little steps, clarification, as Dylan already said about purpose and why is my work important in this company, and secondly, just that map of stakeholders. Building that up could be two of the first little steps that we take to get that change that you are referring to. Otherwise, we're going to end up, I mean, you were referring to Disney, but perhaps in this part of the world we can refer to Rio Tinto in Australia, where the CEO had to resign because the company had destroyed these caves that were important to the Aborigines. I mean, you may actually find yourself in a situation, if you don't understand who your stakeholders are and what their influence is, that you actually have to resign.
And nobody thinks this is going to be easy, but these are the smartest people. They earn the highest salaries, and sometimes they're more influential than some of the top leaders of government. So, if we don't look to them for accountability, where else do we go with this? To the points that I think we're making earlier. And just while on accountability, then Patrick, coming to you now. So, can we say we're at the point where, with some of the examples that have already been quoted, where we can hold business leaders responsible and accountable, when we can fire a CEO because he or she was unable to look at the environmental considerations of an action that's been taken, just as much as they could get fired for not maximizing shareholder values?
Sure. It comes back to a point that Narayan made, which is, how do you measure this? You've got to give them, they must know what their job is. It's quite easy to say, if you make this profit, this is your formula for your stock options, and so they go for it. When you have a long list, you've got to look after your employees, you've got to look after your customers, you've got to look after your stakeholders, a whole bunch of that. How does a board communicate, those targets? If they are not at least specified in some way, how do you hold them responsible in the first place? They say, well, I did my best, But if boards actually spell out their role, of the CEO, and say, listen, I'm going to measure you on all of these. You have a good committee that sits down and tells the CEO, these are our values, and these are our stakeholders, and you've got to look after all of them. Okay, your remuneration might be based on some formula, but somebody has to communicate that to the CEO, and the CEO must be clear. So, for example, you take his P&O. If the board had not told him, listen, looking after an employee is your job, and you do what the CEO did, and just ignored all the laws and just sacked them all, then he can't sort of say, I did my job. He can't, because the board should actually give him a list of things that we as a board want you to do. So that part of it is where I think a bit of attention needs to be given. How do you hold a CEO accountable for sustainability? For climate change. It's easy to say he'll just tick the box. Yeah, I did this. Here's my report. Da, da, da. At the end of the day, my profits decide my salary. So that's where I think we're still a little bit stuck. Many boards, many CEOs, really, I like to be the nice guy, but I'm paid by my profitability. So that's what I go after. So, now, would you made that point just now.
I completely agree, Patrick. And just a very quick interjection, there are models where different voices can be heard to hold management teams accountable to multiple goals, right? So, for example, the German Vorstand is an approximation where at least workers' rights are held in governance bodies. So like this. But that's what I mean when I say it takes a village. You need to change not just the institutions, but the norms of these institutions, how they govern, who sits where, all these sorts of things, in order to get to the goal that we want to go to, right? So yes, it's a journey. Is it valuable? What choice do we have, right? But the argument, as I said here, is about the way to get there.
Well, forgive me, but I think there's enough examples that we've talked about today also of even if you have all the regulations in place, that's not necessarily a guarantee for good behavior. And so we do have to keep that in mind too. And perhaps since we're talking about steward leadership and doing the right thing, the fate of a planet is hanging in the balance. Isn't that incentive enough for CEOs to act upon? Do we still need all of these
Not
external
from a game-theoretic
accountabilities?
perspective. We'll end up, in the prisoner's dilemma and the bad box. That's where we will end up. Right? You have to create the correct incentives, otherwise we will end up in the bad box. So it is not enough. The goal, just the fact that we have the goal out there, and look, I have kids, I may have grandkids soon. I care about what happens to this planet, but at the same time, you've got to say, based on the evidence, what's the best way to get to the outcome you want? And just the pressure of saying this is the right thing to do will not be enough. Sorry, but Richard.
Richard probably, yeah.
Stop feeling sorry for CEOs and boards in the sense that in the sense that these are people who are highly driven, who have got to the top by one means or other, are exceptionally well paid, and at the first whiff of problems, they tend to do an element of, not my, oh Lord, oh no, help, help, help. Oh, I only tried to do the right thing. Boards, how is the board appointed? Usually it's packed by cronies, friends, people who've been on other boards. You do my board, I'll do your board. And let me tell you, as a journalist with 40 years experience, when things go wrong, trying to get an interview with any member of a board of a company that's in deep trouble is just about impossible. They never want to speak. Oh, they'll take the money. They'll take their board fees and their board meetings in their exotic places. But they won't actually want to say, we made a mistake. United was a good example in that case, with that. Finally, it's not the difficult issues today, and this is something you've alluded to, are the social issues. It is right to life. It is LGBT. It is women's rights in the workplace. It's diversity. These are the ones, along with the environment, yes, but the environment the board can get round to some extent. The CEO needs to have a strong moral compass on these social issues. Otherwise, that's where the main problems seem to come today.
Absolutely.
I have two quick comments, because I know you want to go to the questions. But first of all, I slightly disagree with Narayan when he says it takes a village to change. Because then it's so easy to say, oh, the village doesn't want me to change. And I have no responsibility anymore. I think we still have, as CEOs, as leaders, we have a personal responsibility to pursue other goals than only profit-oriented goals. So that's my first point. Let me keep it on that one. Sort of, it's not only the village. We do have a personal responsibility.
Thank you, Arnoud. That's a great
I want
place.
to just make one point that you've got to find the right CEO in answer to Richard. If you've got the wrong CEO, doesn't have the values, you know, when there's a crisis, he just falls apart. He or she falls apart. So you do need to pick that CEO with all those values that you want in a good CEO, so that when the crisis comes, he takes the right decisions.
Okay. I do want to get to at least a couple of audience questions. So one very interesting one on competition, which I think we haven't addressed directly yet. So competition, the desire to win, is one of the timeless forces of human nature. How do we harness this constructively to encourage and accelerate stewardship in an objective way? Competition. Harnessing competition.
Change the definition of winning, and then the competition will work.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll have to elaborate a little bit.
No, I mean, it's simple. Right now, there's a shareholder value, which is winning, right? If you change the definition of winning, that same competition will drive you towards a different goal.
Okay. And any other comments from anybody else? Okay, and I think something else that's quite interesting and may relate a little bit. How do you reconcile many of the tech companies, especially the unicorns, not being profitable and driving inclusion as their purpose? Is that an excuse for not being profitable? Do I need to repeat the question? It's a bit...
Yes.
Richard speaking.
Anybody wants to answer that question?
They're not profitable. They're not profitable because they haven't reached size or scale or that. I mean, it's not as if they don't wish to be profitable. It's not as if they're sitting there as NGOs or charities saying, oh, we don't want to make any profits. The reason they're not profitable is because they haven't succeeded yet. And therefore, they haven't hit the nirvana of profitability, but they've got to attract workers in an environment where inclusion is considered to be important and as a value. But don't get the idea that they are all sort of some good Samaritans. That tech lot want to make money, and they're going to sell out to the highest amount to realize their investment as quickly as they can.
Yeah, and they don't make money today, but the whole idea, and I assume that investors are relatively wise, but the whole idea is that they will be profitable in the future, right? That's the whole point.
I'm puzzled by this question.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you may not be profitable, but if that's your purpose, you continue doing what, you know, your purpose is. And one day you will be profitable.
Yeah.
So it's not one or the other, not one being an excuse for the other. So, you know, I think you should put the profits aside. If you have a purpose, just keep the purpose under your armpit and just keep going.
Okay, maybe I'll ask a much more direct question then, which is easier to understand. So how should or could, I've just lost the question.
Is there?
No, actually, I think they've moved this around. So basically, the question was about what happens if a CEO just turns around and says, well, I think it comes from my earlier question about stakeholders, about employees saying they won't work for you if you don't emphasize societal goals, etc. So what happens if a CEO just turns around and says that, well, if you don't want to work for me because this is not what I believe in, then go ahead and leave?
In today's environment, that's not going to do very well, but at the same time, it's extremely unlikely that that's going to maximize shareholder value, if that's the argument, right?
Because you're going to lose talent.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, I think they've got the question up. So what would you say to a CEO who says, if people don't want to work for my company because they aren't aligned with the mission and values, which in my case is primarily to make money, then they can just leave? So to the point that you already made, I think. Okay.
I would add to that, it is actually the role of a leader to convince people, to convince your teams of your values and assure that they see that you carry those values, that you believe in them, and that you make other people enthusiastic about these values. So I would say, no, if you don't believe in it, you go. I rather would say, I'm going to try to convince you that I have the right values in this organization.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we do have more questions from the audience, but I'm being given signals that we're out of time. So, very interesting to hear views on different sides of this. Clearly not an easy issue to resolve, but at the same time, what is very clear comes through absolutely is that the societal and environmental impact is just too big a stake to let our CEOs have a get out of jail free card on this one. So we'll close this with a big thank you to our panelists and perhaps an ending statement to all the CEOs and business leaders listening out there. A question to you: with the fate of the planet hanging in the balance and the futures of our children and potentially grandchildren hanging out there, if not now, then when? And if not you, then who? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.